The Roman Empire didn't lose many battles, but when it did, the ground itself seemed to turn against it. Deep in the shadows of an ancient forest, the most disciplined army on earth, battle-hardened, organized, unstoppable, simply vanished. No grand clash of armies, no heroic last stand, just mud, trees, and silence. 3 entire legions marched into the German wilderness and were erased. Not defeated, not routed, erased. So here's the question that should bother you. How does a superpower collapse without ever seeing its enemy? At the height of its power, Rome believed it could conquer anything, from the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa to the wind-swept coasts of Britain. The empire expanded with mechanical precision. Roads, legions, order, it all moved like clockwork. But beyond the Rhine River lay something different, a world that didn't play by Roman rules. No cities to siege, no kings to defeat, no clear battlefield, just endless forest and tribes who refused to fight the way Rome understood war. This is the story of the moment Rome hit its limit, not because it lacked strength, but because it faced something it couldn't control. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why the Roman dream of conquering Germania didn't just fail, it shattered. And more importantly, you'll see how geography, strategy, and one man's betrayal exposed a fatal weakness in the greatest war machine of the ancient world. But to get there, we need to step into the forest, where visibility fades, discipline cracks, and the rules of empire stop working. Picture the Roman world at the turn of the 1st century AD. Under Emperor Augustus, Rome wasn't just expanding, it was consolidating power on a scale the world had never seen. Provinces like Gaul had been absorbed, taxed, and transformed into engines of wealth. Roads cut through the land like arteries, carrying soldiers, supplies, and messages with ruthless efficiency. Roman warfare wasn't just about fighting, it was about infrastructure. Control the land, build the roads, establish the cities, and the rest would follow. But Germania was different. Beyond the Rhine River, there were no urban centers waiting to be captured, no dense networks of trade, no agricultural surplus to exploit. Instead, there were scattered tribes, fluid, decentralized, fiercely independent. As historians like Mary Beard and Adrian Goldsworthy often emphasize, Rome's strength came from its ability to impose structure. Germania offered none. And then there was the terrain. Forget the open plains of Italy or the rolling fields of Gaul. Germania was a labyrinth. Dense, ancient forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, swamps that swallowed men whole, paths that disappeared overnight. There were no roads, at least none that Rome could rely on. Every step forward meant carving a path through a hostile, shifting environment. Now imagine trying to move tens of thousands of soldiers through that. Heavy armor, siege equipment, supply wagons stretching for miles. The Roman army wasn't just a fighting force, it was a moving city. And in Germania, that city became a liability. Before we go deeper, quick pause. If you're into cinematic deep dives like this, hit subscribe and drop a like. Because what happens next is where everything starts to unravel. Rome didn't just stumble into disaster, it walked into it, confidently. Publius Quinctilius Varus wasn't a reckless general. He was a political appointee, tasked with turning Germania into a functioning Roman province. Taxation, administration, integration, the usual process. And for a moment, it seemed to work. Alliances were formed, local leaders cooperated, among them a man named Arminius. Arminius was no ordinary tribal leader. He had been trained by Rome itself, served in its armies, understood its tactics, its discipline, its strengths, and its blind spots. To Rome, he was an ally. To his people, he was something else entirely. He saw what others didn't. Rome's power depended on predictability, structured formations, clear lines of command, open terrain. Remove those, and the machine starts to break. In the year 9 AD, Varus received reports of unrest deep within Germania. Nothing unusual, small tribal revolts were expected. Arminius advised immediate action. Lead the legions into the interior, crush the rebellion before it spread. Varus agreed, and that decision would change history. The army marched out, 3 legions, auxiliaries, camp followers, supply trains, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people moving as one. But this wasn't a battlefield march. It was a column, stretched thin, winding through unfamiliar terrain. No tight formations, no clear lines, just a long, vulnerable snake cutting through the forest. Then the weather turned. Rain, cold, relentless. The ground softened into mud. Wagons slowed. Soldiers struggled to keep formation. Communication broke down. Visibility dropped. And then the attacks began. Not all at once. Small strikes, ambushes from the trees, javelins thrown from invisible positions. Then silence. The Romans tried to regroup, to form lines, but there was no space, no visibility, no enemy to engage directly. This wasn't war as they knew it. This was something else. Over the next several days, the Roman army was systematically dismantled, not through a single decisive battle, but through exhaustion, confusion, and constant pressure. The forest itself became a weapon. The canopy blocked signals, the mud slowed movement, the terrain fractured command structures. And Arminius, he disappeared, only to reappear at the head of the Germanic forces. The betrayal was complete.
What made this disaster so devastating wasn't just the ambush. It was the realization that Rome's greatest strengths had become weaknesses. Discipline required visibility. Command required communication. Logistics required infrastructure. Germania offered none of these. The Roman supply system, designed for regions with farms, towns, and roads, collapsed almost immediately. There was no grain to requisition, no local support. Every piece of food, every weapon, every tool had to be carried in. And now those supplies were stuck in mud or abandoned. Even the armor became a burden. Heavy shields and metal gear, so effective in open combat, dragged soldiers down in the swampy terrain. Mobility vanished, flexibility disappeared. And the enemy? They didn't need formations. They didn't need supply lines. They knew the land. They moved through it like ghosts. This wasn't just a battle. It was a complete systems failure. By the time the surviving Romans attempted to break out, it was too late. Varus, realizing the scale of the catastrophe, took his own life. Standard-bearers buried their eagles to prevent capture, though many were lost, and the legions ceased to exist. Rome had been broken, not by a stronger army, but by a smarter environment. There are moments in history where everything shifts. Teutoburg was one of them. The first was the betrayal of Arminius, a man who proved that Rome's strategy of integration could backfire spectacularly. By training local elites, Rome created allies, but also potential enemies who understood exactly how to dismantle its system. The second was the collapse of command. Roman warfare depended on hierarchy, clear orders flowing from top to bottom. But in the forest, that chain was severed. Units became isolated. Officers couldn't communicate. The army lost its greatest advantage, coordination. And finally, the psychological impact. Imagine being a Roman soldier trained for open battle, now trapped in a forest where the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every step could be your last. Discipline doesn't just break physically, it breaks mentally. This wasn't just defeat, it was terror. The aftermath was immediate and brutal.
When news reached Augustus, he reportedly cried out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions!" But they were gone. And more importantly, so was the illusion that Rome could conquer anything. From that moment on, the strategy changed. Rome didn't abandon Germania entirely, but it stopped trying to fully absorb it. Campaigns continued under generals like Germanicus, but they were punitive, not expansionist. The goal shifted from conquest to containment. Economics played a role too.
Unlike Gaul, Germania offered little immediate wealth. No cities to tax, no vast agricultural output, just endless land and endless resistance. As scholars like Greg Wolfe have pointed out, empire isn't just about winning battles, it's about sustaining control, and Germania wasn't worth the cost. So Rome drew a line. The Rhine and Danube rivers became natural frontiers. Fortifications rose, the Limes Germanicus, not as a symbol of strength, but as an admission of limits. For the first time, Rome wasn't expanding, it was holding. But here's where things get even more interesting. What if Teutoburg wasn't just a failure, but a turning point that shaped the entire future of Europe? What if the line drawn in those forests is still visible today, in culture, language, even identity? Because the world beyond Rome didn't disappear, it grew, it adapted, and centuries later, it would come back to challenge the empire in ways far more devastating than anything Varus faced. So the real question is, did Rome stop at the frontier, or did the frontier start pushing back? If you want to explore how those same Germanic tribes eventually played a role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and how the line between civilized and barbarian blurred over time, drop a comment below. And if you made it this far, you already know this is the kind of history that changes how you see the world. So hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who thinks Rome never lost. Because sometimes the most powerful empire in history doesn't fall in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it just walks into the forest and never comes back. See you next video.